There are pains that time doesn't heal, it only transforms. Frodo Baggins saved Middle-earth, but lost something no one saw: peace itself. After the destruction of the One Ring, when everyone celebrated the victory, he discovered that the true enemy wasn't Sauron, nor the fire of Mount Doom. It was the silence that followed. That invisible, profound emptiness that slowly consumes the heart of those who carried the weight of evil and survived it. Sam, faithful to the end, watched his friend fade. Away little by little, like a candle burning even without wind. And somewhere, in the shadows of the past, Gollum's whisper still echoed, the living memory of what the ring had left behind. This is the story of the burden no one saw, of the voice that never truly fell silent, of the emotional price a hero pays when the world calls him a winner, but he feels lost. And before we begin, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? I like to imagine each of these places as small points of light, scattered but connected by this journey. If this story resonates with you in any way, please leave a like. It helps keep this voice alive here. And if you're not yet part of our community, subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will show you the part of the journey that few dare to tell. At first, the ring seemed like just an object, an ancient artifact, too heavy for its size, cold to the touch, but harmless in appearance. Frodo carried it with the same care one has for a precious heirloom, something left by Bilbo, a symbol of trust. But there was something about it that didn't fit into the silence of the Shire nights. When everyone slept and the wind passed gently through the windows, Frodo felt as if the air around him changed, as if time slowed down for an instant, and his heart, without warning, beat faster. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was just the weight of responsibility, the fear of what the wizard had revealed. But little by little, the silence began to change shape. What was once an absence of sound now seemed like an invitation, a space filled with something invisible. It wasn't words, yet. It was as if the thought was no longer solely his. When he looked at the ring, he felt a subtle presence, something observing him from within the gold, as if a hidden gaze existed there, always awake, always patient. The world around him might be at peace, but within his mind, a constant noise began to form. A light whisper, impossible to pinpoint, like the wind passing through a cave. Frodo tried to push the idea away. He told himself it was the weariness of the journey, the tension of carrying something so dangerous. But the whisper wouldn't stop. It appeared when his body rested and his mind relaxed, precisely when his defenses opened. At first, they were just fragments of sensation, something like memories, images that didn't belong to him. The glow of the fire, a distant tower, the feeling of absolute power. Then came the words, though voiceless, Frodo. It was almost a call, a sound that seemed to spring from within his own chest. Gradually, the ring ceased to be an object and became a presence. He felt it even when he didn't touch it. It was as if the gold breathed, as if each beat of his heart echoed within the small jewel. The strangest thing was that for a moment, there was something comforting in that sound. The whisper wasn't threatening. It was seductive. It didn't say, "Fear me." It said, "Listen to me." It was the kind of voice that doesn't impose, but invites. And Frodo, without realizing it, began to listen. The human mind, or hobbit mind, has a curious weakness. It seeks meaning even in what it doesn't understand. And that's what the ring exploits. What begins as noise transforms into dialogue. What seems like imagination becomes an answer. Frodo realized that when he thought of something, the ring reacted. A different glow, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration. It was as if it responded to thoughts, as if it understood fear, doubt, desire. The line between will and influence began to blur. There were nights when Frodo would wake with the ring in his hand without remembering having picked it up. Other times, he would find himself holding it in his pocket as if his body were acting on its own. And whenever this happened, the same feeling would come, a momentary calm, a strange sense of belonging. The ring knew when to speak, and more. Importantly, knew when to be silent. It waited, it observed, it learned. And the more Frodo tried to resist, the more the object seemed to understand the nature of his resistance. It was like fighting against his own thoughts. Gradually, Frodo began to understand what Bilbo meant when he spoke of attachment. The ring doesn't impose itself violently, it insinuates itself. It doesn't take, it offers. Its voice doesn't shout, it whispers what already exists within the bearer. Fear, ambition, insecurity, the desire to be useful, to be strong, to protect others. It amplifies what is already there. Frodo began to realize that the ring's true power lay not in its destructive power, but in its ability to convince the bearer that they are doing good. And that is precisely what makes it dangerous. It speaks to the part of you that believes it is in control. Imaginary conversations became inevitable. Frodo walked and, in silence, listened to ideas that weren't his own. Why trust others? Why risk everything when you can solve it yourself? The voice was soft, without apparent malice, but it carried logic. He began to doubt what was right, what was his decision, and what was influence. That was the trap. The slow, invisible, subtle transformation. The ring didn't need to force, it only needed to suggest. What Frodo didn't yet realize was that this voice, so sweet and familiar, didn't come from outside. It came from within. The ring doesn't create evil, it only awakens it. It mirrors what is most vulnerable in a being, and that's why each bearer hears something different. For some, it's power. For others, fear. For Frodo, it was duty. The weight of responsibility became the perfect chain. And it was at this point that the fear began to change shape. What was once fear of the enemy became fear of himself. With each new day, the silence grew denser. The ring no longer needed to speak to be heard. It was there, present in every thought, shaping every choice. Frodo began to understand that the true danger was not losing the ring. It was losing it within himself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what comes next is the moment when this invisible presence ceases to be merely a whisper and transforms into real influence, when thought and will merge, and Frodo realizes that the struggle is not only against the power of the ring, but against his own mind. As the camp lay beneath the cloak of night, Frodo remained awake. The wind rustled gently through the trees, and the distant chirping of crickets attempted to create a tranquility he no longer felt. The others slept. Sam snored softly, Merry and Pippin huddled under their blankets. But the silence seemed to carry a different weight that night. It was as if the whole world held its breath, and in the midst of this silence, Frodo heard something. Not an ordinary sound, but a subtle vibration, something that seemed to come from within him, and yet from very far away. It was the ring. He didn't see it shine, but he felt it pulsing, a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, like a second heart beating in another body. Each pulse seemed to call his name, not in a human voice, but in a frequency that only the mind recognizes. Frodo tried to resist, turned to his side, covered his face with his cloak, but the call persisted. Frodo. The word didn't pass through the air. It passed through thought. It was as if the ring spoke in the language of emotions, seeping into the cracks of consciousness. The fear he felt wasn't the fear of physical danger. It was something more intimate, more subtle, the fear of being known from the inside. The ring seemed to understand his feelings, his doubts, his fragility, And worse, it used this delicately. It didn't attack him, it invited him, it didn't shout, it whispered. It was a form of manipulation disguised as comfort. Frodo realized that the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the call grew. It was like trying not to think about something and, in the act of resisting, strengthening it even more. In those moments, time ceased to exist. The campfire was dying down, the embers were dying, and he was still there, motionless, listening to the echo of something invisible. The sensation was strange, his body present in the camp, but his mind wandering in a space that didn't belong to that world. He began to feel a kind of warmth in his chest, an artificial, non-physical warmth. It was the ring pulsing inside the bag, as if responding to his restlessness. And it was in that instant that Frodo understood a hidden truth. The ring was not merely an artifact of power. It was a consciousness. What Bilbo had felt for so long, that inexplicable attachment, wasn't simple obsession. It was connection. The ring creates a bond with its bearer. It studies him, learns his fears, his intentions, and speaks through them. And the most dangerous thing is that its voice doesn't sound strange. It sounds familiar. It's as if it were his own inner voice, but distorted, amplified by a desire that isn't truly his. Frodo was beginning to doubt what came from within and what came from without. This confusion was the first step towards control. Sometimes the voice seemed innocent, almost protective. "You are alone, Frodo. They don't understand what you carry." Other times it became persuasive, offering logic disguised as care. If you used the power just a little, you could end it all sooner. You would end their suffering. That was how the ring infiltrated, not with imposition, but with reason. And Frodo, despite fighting against it, felt the seduction of the idea. The ring's power lay not in its magical force, but in its ability to make sense. The early mornings became the stage for this silent battle. When everyone slept, Frodo and the ring conversed in a kind of invisible dialogue. He dared not tell anyone, not even Sam, who was the most faithful and devoted. How could he explain that an object spoke to him? That, sometimes in the darkest hours, he almost gave in. It was a struggle that left no physical marks, but consumed his spirit. Frodo's face began to change. The lightness of his hobbit eyes gave way to a more distant, more vigilant expression. He slept less, spoke less, and carried the ring ever closer to his body. There were moments when the call seemed to intensify, as if the ring knew something was about to happen. When the Nazgul approached, Frodo felt the object vibrate. It was as if it recognized the danger and at the same time desired it. The ring yearned to return to its origin, to the darkness from whence it came, and Frodo, without realizing it, became the path to that. This duality, being the hero and the risk, was what tormented him most. He was not only fighting against Sauron, he was fighting against his own instinct to give in. The power of the One Ring manifested itself as something alive. It behaved like a patient predator, one that doesn't need to attack because it knows the prey will eventually come of its own accord. Frodo perceived this, and yet there were moments when he doubted his own strength. Each day, the bond grew stronger, and each night, the call became clearer, more intimate. It was no longer just a voice calling him. It was a feeling of belonging, of inevitable destiny. This relationship between the ring-bearer and the ring is a profound metaphor for the human mind. It shows how power, guilt, and fear converse within us. The ring spoke to Frodo, but in reality it revealed what was already dormant within him. The desire to be enough, the fear of failure, the need to prove his worth. And the more he tried to distance himself, the more the ring enveloped him, showing that fleeing from one's own abyss is the same as walking towards it. There was a night when Frodo awoke from a dream with the ring burning in his hand. He didn't know if it had been real. The sound of his name still echoed in the back of his mind, and for a moment he felt the object pulse in sync with his heart. It was a living connection, an invasion disguised as destiny. What began as a burden now felt like a bond, and it is at this point that the boundary between the hero and the dominated begins to disappear. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is in the silence of the night, where the calling grows stronger and reason weakens, that Frodo begins to understand the true extent of the ring's power. Not the power to control the world, but the power to master the soul. There was a time when Frodo fully believed he had mastered the ring. He thought that the evil power, however ancient and profound, could not bend the mind of someone with a pure heart. But what he didn't yet understand was that true mastery of the ring didn't happen violently, it happened silently. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible infiltration that began within the mind, in the places where thought forms before becoming word. Gradually, Frodo began to realize that ideas were arising within him that didn't seem to be his own. At first he ignored them, believing they were merely daydreams brought on by fear or the weariness of the journey. But over time, something began to change. He could no longer clearly distinguish what came from himself and what was a whisper. It was as if the ring had found a breach. It no longer spoke in tones that came from outside. It spoke from within. Subtle thoughts, perfectly fitted together without the strangeness of an alien voice. The kind of thought that could very well have been born naturally in his mind, but which left a slight feeling of intrusion, like a dream he didn't remember dreaming. They don't trust you. You don't need them. You were chosen because you are the only one capable. At first, Frodo felt guilty for thinking this way. Then he began to convince himself that perhaps there was some truth in these ideas. The boundary between consciousness and influence began to disappear. The ring didn't dominate him by force. It persuaded him with the subtlety of a mirror. It reflected what he already feared, amplified what he already felt. Frodo's mind became an invisible battlefield where the enemy had no face. It was a war of thoughts, and he never knew when he was being defeated. Sometimes, while walking with Sam, he noticed phrases forming in his mind, phrases that weren't his own, but that fit the situations perfectly. They were reasonings so logical that it was difficult to reject them. Sam wouldn't understand the weight you carry. Perhaps it's better not to trust Gandalf. If you fail, everyone will die, and it will be your fault. That's what the ring did. It used truth to lie. This was the cruelest part of the process. The ring didn't need to distort reality. It only needed to present it from a different angle. Frodo saw the world with the same eyes, but people's intentions seemed altered. He looked at Sam and saw loyalty, but also perceived fear. He saw Gandalf as a guide, but now imagined the wizard hiding something. It was a seed of distrust planted in his mind and watered by his own anxiety. Over time, he began to doubt himself. If he couldn't trust his own thinking, how could he trust anything else? This mental confusion slowly isolated him. Frodo spoke less, observed more, and when he did speak, his words came with a caution that hadn't existed before. Each sentence seemed measured, weighed, as if he feared someone might hear what he himself didn't understand. It was the beginning of paranoia, not the kind born from the fear of being followed, but the kind born from the fear of oneself. He felt the ring watching him even when he was calm, even when he tried to rest. It was like living inside a mind that no longer completely belonged to him. The nights grew longer. Frodo dreamed of places he had never seen, burning towers, shadows ablaze, eyeless faces calling to him, and upon waking, these images did not disappear. They remained like echoes, mingling with the thoughts of the day. The world around him seemed grayer, heavier, as if reality itself were being contaminated by that invisible presence. He tried to distract himself, to talk, to think of simple things. The Shire, the wind, the sound of the water, but the ring always found a way to return, to hint that the world would only be peaceful again when he wore it. There is something profoundly human in this kind of torment. The idea of losing control over one's own thoughts is one of the most terrifying experiences there is. Frodo, without realizing it, was living a kind of mirror image of what many would call today an internal conflict. The ring took advantage of this, of vulnerability, of the fear of making mistakes, of the pressure of carrying an impossible responsibility. It didn't need to impose itself. It only needed to make Frodo believe that its suggestions were intuitions. It was a refined manipulation, acting like an emotional infection. And it's curious to see how the mind reacts to power. The more Frodo tried to push away its influence, the more it grew. It was like fighting against a fixed thought. The more he rejects it, the stronger it becomes. The ring knew this. It fed on resistance, molding itself to the attempt at control. At certain moments, Frodo no longer knew if he was fighting or collaborating. What was once repulsion now seemed inevitable. The people around noticed the change. Sam perceived the longer silences, the empty answers. The gleam in Frodo's eyes seemed different, as if weariness had become part of him. And yet, no one imagined the depth of it, because the kind of prison Frodo was in didn't have bars. He had thoughts, and they were so compelling that they seemed like truths. At that point, the ring no longer needed to whisper. It had learned to use Frodo's own voice to express itself, and that is why the danger was so great. The bearer believed he was deciding of his own free will, but in reality, he was being guided by an invisible force. It was the perfect illusion that there is still a choice. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is at this stage that the ring ceases to be an object and becomes a total presence, a living consciousness within the bearer, shaping every decision and transforming the external journey into an inner war where the enemy takes on the face of the mind itself. What made the One Ring so dangerous was not only the power it contained, but the way it presented itself. It never came with threats, never demanded direct submission. Instead, it offered something that seemed harmless, even just: order, peace, solution. The ring spoke to Frodo in an almost rational way, as if it were a wise advisor, not an evil force. It didn't say dominate the world, it said save it. It didn't say control others, but bring balance. It was this subtlety that transformed power into a trap, because it made it seductive even to the purest. As the days passed, Frodo began to understand why so many before him had fallen. The promise was not destruction, it was relief. It was the end of pain, of disorder, of injustice. The ring took advantage of the exhaustion, the emotional weight of the journey, and planted a simple, almost logical idea. If you had the power, everything would be different. This phrase repeated itself in his mind like a soft echo, an innocent hypothesis that was beginning to seem true. Frodo, tired and surrounded by suffering, began to feel that perhaps control was the only real way to help. The ring's voice knew how to adapt to the mind of its bearer. With Frodo, it didn't use the language of ambition, it used that of compassion. He wasn't tempted by glory, but by the hope of ending the suffering of others. Power didn't present itself as dominion, but as responsibility. You have seen the world's pain. You could prevent it from happening again. That's how the ring ensnared him, transforming heroism into justification, and Frodo, who had always fought against evil, began to realize that evil sometimes disguises itself as good intentions. During the long walks, he felt the weight of the gold as something different. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The ring seemed to vibrate, to respond to his thoughts. When Frodo thought of protecting Sam, he felt a surge of energy, almost an approval. When he doubted, the ring weighed more. It was as if the object was shaping his feelings, adjusting his behavior according to what it wanted to hear. And the more he tried to resist, the more he realized that resistance brought him closer to the same point, the desire to have control over that which he could not control. It's curious how this dynamic reflects something profound about human nature. Power rarely comes in the form of open tyranny. It presents itself as a means to do good, to correct what is wrong. The ring perfectly understood this weakness. It whispered the kind of temptation that sounds morally correct. Use me just once, for good, then destroy me. That was the perfect lie. The idea that one can use evil to achieve good, and then simply get rid of it. But Frodo began to realize that absolute power doesn't let itself be used. It is power that uses. What was most unsettling was that for a moment, everything made sense. The world truly seemed too unjust to be left to chance. War, death, fear, all of that could end if he accepted the power. It would only take one decision. It would only take yielding. The ring didn't ask for servitude, it asked for purpose. It offered the feeling of being in control, of being the only one capable of putting everything in order. And that's exactly what makes the temptation irresistible. It wears the face of reason. Frodo began to notice how the ring altered his perception of reality. He looked at people and saw weaknesses he hadn't seen before. He saw fear where he had previously seen loyalty, selfishness where he had previously seen love. It was as if the power gave him a bitter clarity, the kind of vision that separates the observer from the one who feels. He began to distance himself. Empathy, which had always been his strength, began to transform into judgment. The ring didn't make him cruel, but cold. It made him believe that understanding too much was the same as elevating himself above others. That was the true seduction of control, the feeling that by understanding suffering, you gain the right to decide what is best for others. Power doesn't shout, it convinces. And Frodo, without realizing it, was already beginning to think like a Lord of the Rings, not out of malice, but out of necessity. It was a slow, almost imperceptible, but inevitable transformation. He wanted to protect, but deep down the desire to protect already concealed the desire to dominate, and the ring knew this. At times he imagined what it would be like if everything ended differently. If he used the power for just an instant, just enough to eliminate Sauron, restore peace, liberate Middle-earth. The idea was tempting because it seemed fair. But the ring answered this thought with something even more dangerous. A sensation of pleasure. A brief moment of euphoria. A warm current coursing through his body. It was as if it were saying, "Yes, that's it. You understand now." This sensation, which came and went in seconds, was what made him dependent. Control is a vice disguised as a virtue. And Frodo was beginning to get a taste of it. Every time he thought about using the power, even if only for a second, the world around him seemed smaller, easier to comprehend. It was a perfect illusion, the idea that chaos could be bent by will. But deep down, what the ring did was the opposite. The more Frodo tried to control fate, the more he became controlled by it. This is one of the darkest truths about power. It doesn't just transform the world, it transforms whoever wields it. And Frodo, deep down, knew this. The fear that consumed him was no longer the fear of Sauron, but the fear of himself, The line between hero and tyrant was becoming increasingly blurred, and he was beginning to understand something that time would fully reveal. No one wields absolute power with impunity. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject because it is at this point that power ceases to be merely a temptation and becomes an addiction. The moment when the desire to do good begins to be confused with the will to be needed, and the hero dangerously approaches the abyss he swore to destroy. There are battles the world doesn't see, those fought within the mind, in the silence where fear and desire intertwine. Frodo, even while resisting the ring's power, began to realize that something more dangerous than temptation accompanied him. Guilt. It was a silent but constant feeling, like a shadow walking beside him. He felt ashamed for thinking about the ring, for sometimes desiring what he had sworn to destroy. And the more he tried to push these thoughts away, the more they returned, disguised in new forms, more convincing, more intimate. The ring knew him inside out, knew how to infiltrate the cracks in his conscience and transform resistance into remorse. Guilt didn't attack him head-on, it gnawed at him slowly. Every time he looked at Sam, loyal and pure in his devotion, he felt the weight of being different. He wondered if he too had given in, if the ring would speak to others in the same way. This doubt isolated him. Frodo no longer saw the object as something external. It was as if the ring were a part of him. And the cruelest thing was realizing that even hating the power he carried, there was a part of him that didn't want to let it go. This conflict tore him apart, because in his heart he believed that desiring power was the same as being corrupted. The ring wielded this guilt with surgical precision. It whispered when Frodo tried to convince himself that he was still good. You fail every day. You think as I want you to. You are already mine. These were thoughts that didn't come from outside, but seemed to emerge from within, as if Frodo himself were punishing himself. The human mind has this cruel tendency to transform doubt into condemnation. And the ring knew this. It didn't need to force him into anything. It only needed to remind him of his weaknesses. Thus, true control came not through fear, but through shame. As time passed, Frodo began to doubt his own worth. He, who had been chosen for his courage, now saw himself as weak, impure, unworthy of the mission. The burden he carried was no longer just the physical weight of the ring, but the symbolic weight of inadequacy. It was the kind of guilt one doesn't confess to anyone, because it stems from the thought that perhaps it's too late to return to who one once was. This kind of pain is invisible, but it is within it that the power of the ring flourishes. The journey grew increasingly silent. Sam spoke to him, but his words seemed distant, muffled. It was as if the sound of the human voice no longer reached that place in Frodo's mind where he now lived. The ring made him feel isolated, as if no other being could understand what was happening inside him, and this feeling, more than any threat, was what made him vulnerable. Psychological isolation is the most effective trap of power. It convinces you that no one would understand, and therefore you must endure alone. What Frodo felt was more than guilt. It was a kind of emotional self-sabotage. He believed that by failing in thought, he had already betrayed his cause. This belief weakened him, and the ring fed on it. It's the same mechanism that often destroys people from the inside. The weight of blaming oneself for feeling what is inevitable to feel. The desire for power, for ease, for escaping pain. These are human feelings. But for Frodo, this became sin. He couldn't accept that resisting didn't mean never being tempted. And this confusion made him believe he was already lost, even as he continued to fight. There were nights when he wondered if he was still himself. If that tired look he saw reflected in the water was that of Frodo Baggins, the hobbit from the Shire, or someone completely different, guilt made him doubt his own identity. It was as if every impure thought erased a part of who he was. The ring made him believe that the simple act of resisting meant weakness. It transformed courage into burden. And the more Frodo resisted, the more he blamed himself for still hearing the voice. This emotional spiral is the kind of thing that destroys you from the inside out. Frodo began to realize that guilt was more devastating than fear itself. Fear can be confronted, but guilt disguises itself as morality. It makes the victim believe they deserve the suffering, and that's how the ring won, not by force, but by manipulating the sense of entitlement. Frodo believed he needed to pay a price for his thoughts, and the ring became the currency of that punishment. It's curious how the mind seeks punishment when it feels guilty. Frodo began to distance himself from the light, to accept pain as something necessary, almost redemptive. He no longer saw resistance as a struggle, but as penance, and in this inversion of logic, the ring solidified itself as an indispensable presence. It was as if the burden was the only link that kept him connected to the mission. Pain became part of his identity. This is a type of silent, almost imperceptible but profound transformation. Frodo no longer saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as the bearer of a mistake that needed to be repaired, even if no one else blamed him. And the more he carried the ring, the more he felt he deserved the weight. It's the nature of guilt. It feeds on itself. It sustains itself on its own resistance until the person no longer knows if they are fighting against something or simply punishing themselves for existing. Sam saw his friend's suffering but didn't understand its depth. He thought it was just exhaustion, the fear of the journey. But what Frodo faced was a kind of loneliness that not even the purest love could break, because guilt creates an invisible wall, and no one crosses what the mind believes they deserve. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what comes next is the darkest part of this journey. The moment when guilt ceases to be a burden and transforms into identity. When suffering stops being a consequence and becomes the only way to feel worthy of continuing. The Dead Marshes were not merely a place on the map, they were a distorted mirror of the soul. When Frodo arrived there, the air felt different, heavy, almost thick, as if the air itself carried memories too old to be forgotten. There was an apparent calm, but it did not bring peace. It was the kind of silence that makes the heart slow down and the instinct urge to turn back. The ground was damp and treacherous, shrouded in mist that concealed everything just a few steps ahead. The dark waters reflected a pale light, as if the world there had no sun, only the echo of an ancient glow, dead along with the bodies that slept beneath the surface. Sam tried to guide the way, treading carefully, but Frodo barely heard. Something about that place irresistibly drew his attention. It was as if the ring, in silence, had found fertile ground. The whisper within his mind returned, more intense, but now there was something new. Voices, not one, not two, but dozens. They were murmurs that mingled with the wind, sometimes sounding like distant cries, sometimes prayers. Frodo stopped, breathless. The sound didn't come from outside, but his body reacted as if it did. He looked at the water, and that's when he saw them. Pale faces, floating beneath the surface, eyes open, motionless, as if time had stopped at the instant of death. These were the souls of the dead, victims of ancient battles, elves, men and orcs, all together, indistinguishable in the same fate. Death had leveled what war had separated. Frodo felt his heart tighten, not with fear, but with compassion. Those figures seemed to call for something, perhaps for rest, perhaps for remembrance. And it was at that moment that the ring spoke again, but in a different way. They are there because of the weak, because of those who hesitated. It was a soft, cold voice that seemed to understand the pain he felt and use it against him. The ring knew that Frodo had a compassionate heart, and it was precisely for this reason that it began to attack. He knelt, drawn by the shimmering lights that flickered beneath the water. They looked like fragile blue flames, like souls trying to reach the air. Sam called to him, but he didn't answer. The world above the water vanished. There was only the reflection, the surface, and the voices. They spoke softly, in ancient tongues, but Frodo understood the meaning, even without comprehending. The words, it was as if they were showing him fragments of memories that weren't his own. Pain, regret, broken promises. The souls didn't threaten him. They asked to be seen. And what began as compassion turned to fascination. The ring took advantage of this moment of vulnerability. It made the voices sound familiar. One, sweet and distant, sounded like Gandalf's, another like Bilbo's. Frodo shuddered. It was impossible, but the sound was too real to ignore. His mind tried to rationalize, but his heart had already believed. He leaned further over the water, feeling the cold rise in his hands. The voices began to call him by name. Frodo. And in that instant, he felt he could fall, that perhaps he wanted to fall, because there was something profoundly seductive in that invitation. It was as if the weight of the ring disappeared for a second, replaced by the promise of rest. Gollum pulled him back violently. "Don't look at them! Don't look!" he shouted, his panic evident. Frodo fell, backward, gasping, as if he had awakened from a trance, but his gaze remained fixed on the water. He knew something had happened there. For a brief instant, he had felt the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and the ring had crossed that boundary with him. The object pulsed in his chest, warm, almost alive. It was as if the voices of the dead were his allies, instruments of the same power that had watched him from the beginning. The fear Frodo felt now was different. It wasn't just fear of the place, but of realizing how much he had allowed himself to be enveloped. He hadn't just heard the voices, he had responded to them. The ring showed that it could use any form to reach him. Fear, love, pity. Each emotion was a door, and all led to the same destination. Frodo began to realize that there was no absolute defense. Everything he felt could be corrupted, used, distorted, even compassion. And this revelation shook him deeply because it was proof that no one, not even he, was immune to the power of corruption. The dead marshes were not merely a place of passage, they were a test, a reminder that evil destroys not only through force, but through misdirected empathy. The souls did not wish to harm him. They simply called to him, seeking companionship in their eternal solitude. And the ring knew that, for someone like Frodo, the desire to alleviate the pain of others was the perfect trap. He was beginning to understand that the greatest temptation was not power, but relief. The rest promised by the voices was merely another kind of dominion. Dominion disguised as peace. As they walked out of that dark swamp, the sound of voices still lingered. They echoed softly, mingled with the sound of the water and the wind. Sometimes he swore he heard them saying they would wait for him. Frodo's gaze was distant, as if something inside him had been left behind, trapped beneath the water. Gollum watched in silence, and for a moment seemed to understand, perhaps because he too had heard those voices before. The journey continued, but the swamp remained within him. It was a vivid memory, a constant reminder that even good intentions can turn into abysses. And what haunted Frodo now was not the souls themselves, but the feeling that he had almost wished to stay with them. Almost. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened in the dead marshes was more than a scare. It was the beginning of silent madness. It's the moment when Frodo begins to understand that the power of the ring lies not only in dominating the body or the will, but in altering the very perception of reality, making the bearer see beauty even in that which destroys. When Frodo encountered Gollum, something inside him silently broke. He had heard of the creature, the former ring-bearer, corrupted to the bone by the force of something that seemed to live and breathe within the gold. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. Gollum was not merely a creature deformed by time and obsession. He was a living reminder of what the ring did to those who served it for too long. Frodo's first reaction was fear, then compassion, and finally, recognition. Because looking into Gollum's pale eyes, he saw something he could not deny. He saw himself. There was a profound, terrifying resemblance that went beyond physical appearance. It was something in the way Gollum spoke of the ring, with love and hate at the same time, as if the object were both a master and a wound. "My precious," he whispered, and those words echoed within Frodo's mind like an omen. He realized he wasn't just seeing an enemy, but a possible future. Gollum was the mirror showing the ultimate form of what the ring did to the spirit, and this realization struck him harder than any sword. The contrast between the two was painful. Frodo was still the bearer who resisted, the one who believed in duty, who carried the burden with courage. Gollum, on the other hand, was the one who had given in, the one who had lost his name, his memory, his identity. But as the journey continued, the differences between them began to diminish. Gollum spoke in double voices, argued with himself, cried and laughed at the same time. And at times, Frodo realized that this internal dialogue was frighteningly familiar. It was the same kind of conflict he himself waged in silence when the ring whispered in his mind. Over time, something unexpected happened. Frodo began to feel empathy for Gollum. It wasn't pity, it was identification. He understood the torment of hearing a voice that never falls silent, the weight of loving what you hate. Gollum wasn't just a warning. He was a constant reminder that corruption doesn't happen all at once, but in fragments. With each choice, each thought, each lingering gaze at the ring, a part of the old self disappears. Frodo began to understand that what made Gollum monstrous wasn't the ring itself, but the time he had spent believing he still controlled it. This is one of the cruelest truths of power. It doesn't transform someone from the outside in, but from the inside out. Gollum was the epitome of what happens when desire becomes identity. And Frodo began to feel fear, not of Gollum, but of the reflection he saw in him. The fear of realizing that, with a little less strength, a little less love, a little more time, he himself would be in that pale skin, dragging himself through the shadows and whispering. Into the void, the boundary between the bearer and the slave of the ring was thinner than it seemed. What's most unsettling is that, even corrupted, Gollum still had moments of humanity, small flashes of kindness, like embers hidden among the ashes. There was a moment when he looked at Frodo with devotion, calling him good sir, and another when his gaze became cold, almost murderous. This oscillation wasn't just madness. It was the internal struggle of someone who still had a spark of conscience fighting against an instinct that dominated him. And Frodo, witnessing this, saw his own battle reflected with painful clarity. The ring doesn't just corrupt, it fragments. It separates the soul into two sides that never reconcile again. Living with Gollum became a grim lesson about the nature of evil and redemption. Frodo realized that Sam's hatred for the creature stemmed from fear, the fear that it represented the truth no one wanted to admit. Because deep down, everyone was vulnerable to that same voice. The difference between Gollum and any other was only time. And Frodo began to realize that perhaps Gollum's greatest punishment was remaining alive, aware of his own ruin. It was an existence made of regret, desire, and guilt, an endless cycle of love and destruction. The psychological impact of this coexistence was profound. Frodo began to adopt a new way of looking at the world, a mixture of empathy and distrust. He saw in Gollum not only a danger, but an opportunity to understand what awaited him if he failed. It was a cruel but necessary mirror. The ring made a point of reminding him of this. Sometimes, when Frodo touched it, he felt a different weight, as if the object vibrated with pleasure at being between two bearers. It was as if the ring itself enjoyed observing the contrast, what resisted and what had already been overcome. And it was there, in conversations with Gollum, that Frodo began to understand a truth no one had told him. Evil rarely presents itself as something monstrous. It presents itself as something understandable. Gollum was not just a victim, he was an accomplice, just as Frodo was becoming one, a little more so each day. This realization brought a mixture of compassion and horror, because deep down, what frightened him most was not the idea of becoming Gollum, but the possibility that he already was. There are moments in the journey when the two seem to switch roles. Frodo speaks with authority, and Gollum obeys him like a faithful servant, but at other times it is Gollum who commands the tension, with simple words, with glances that reveal he understands the ring in a way Frodo doesn't yet. It's as if the disciple were teaching the master, and this reversal left Frodo torn between contempt and envy. Because even destroyed, Gollum possessed something he lacked, absolute sincerity in his own vice. This coexistence mirrored Frodo's transformation, an inner journey where compassion and fear intertwined. He began to realize that the path to Mordor was not merely geographical, but psychological. Each step alongside Gollum was a deeper dive into himself, a slow and inevitable approach to the boundary between humanity and what comes after. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what begins to happen from here on is not just the coexistence of two opposing beings, but the fusion of two consciousnesses. The moment when the bearer and the corrupted begin to mirror each other in such a way that it is no longer possible to tell who is leading and who is being led. Sam had always been Frodo's safe haven, the friend who laughed at the little things, who spoke of the Shire and bare feet on the grass as if the world was still simple. But as the journey progressed, something began to change. Frodo no longer responded in the same way. His eyes were always far away, as if observing something invisible. He walked, yes, but his mind seemed trapped elsewhere, in a kind of silence that neither the sound of the wind nor his friend's voice could penetrate. Sam felt this distance like someone feeling cold, not suddenly but gradually, until he realized he was already trembling. The ring created this chasm. It was as if the object spoke directly to Frodo's heart, whispering truths that only he could hear. Sam tried to talk, tried to understand, but the words no longer found a place. Frodo listened, but didn't hear. There was a constant look of guilt on his face, an invisible weight that made him seem older each day. And Sam, powerless, began to realize what it is to watch someone you love get lost, not in space, but within yourself. The ring's voice was subtle, yet constant. It didn't shout, it didn't demand, it simply persuaded. And the cruelest thing was that Frodo's isolation seemed voluntary. He believed that protecting others meant distancing himself from them, that sharing the burden would be the same as corrupting those who tried to help. It was a distorted logic, but painfully coherent, and so he remained silent. Silence became his form of love, and also his prison. Sam perceived the signs, but didn't understand the whole picture. He saw the distant gaze, the trembling touch on the pocket where the ring rested, the weariness that wasn't just physical. Sometimes Frodo murmured things to himself, names Sam didn't understand, words in strange tongues. Other times, he remained motionless, as if listening to something. In those moments, the air around him seemed denser, as if even the light hesitated to approach. Sam tried to break the spell with simple words, with memories of the Shire. Remember the smell of Rosie's bread, the garden you loved so much? But Frodo only smiled slightly, an empty smile, like someone listening to memories as if observing a life that no longer belongs to him. And there was also fear. Sam didn't talk about it, but he felt it. The fear that his friend would no longer be the same. The fear that, in essence, the ring was winning. Because no matter how much Frodo resisted, his gaze began to change, a mixture of pain, distrust, and something Sam couldn't name. It was as if the love was still there, but bound by invisible chains. And that broke his heart in a way no sword could. Their relationship, once light and spontaneous, began to transform into a kind of silent resistance. Sam spoke less, observed more. He began to realize that every gesture could be interpreted as a threat. A simple attempt to help Frodo carry something could be met with irritation or fear. The ring sowed distrust, creating invisible barriers between them. It was as if it were saying, "It wants what is yours." And Frodo, even without wanting to believe it, felt the doubt growing. This type of isolation is the cruelest, because it happens so subtly that no one notices when it begins. Frodo didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't ask for help. He simply withdrew, a little more each day. And Sam, who had never understood magic or curses, began to feel something he couldn't explain. Powerlessness. He could fight orcs, he could face hunger, cold, mountains, but he couldn't fight what was inside his friend's mind. And that was the real tragedy. Sam's love was pure, but even the most sincere love finds its limits when the other can no longer receive it. There were times when Frodo looked at him and seemed to see him as a stranger. And what hurt Sam wasn't the rejection, it was the awareness that in a way, Frodo was right. There were things inside him that no one could reach. It was as if the ring had created a world apart, an inner dimension where only the bearer could enter, and from which no one emerged the same. Even so, Sam remained, not out of hope, but out of loyalty. He believed that somehow, simply being there was enough. That the simple act of walking beside him, even in silence, was a form of love. And it was. The silence between them, though painful, had a profound meaning. It was the space between the human and the unattainable, between the friend and the chosen one, between love and destiny. Sometimes Frodo would glance at him suddenly, as if resurfacing for a brief moment. In those rare moments, there was something of recognition in his gaze, a glimmer of gratitude, perhaps, or regret. And then he would close himself off again, plunging once more into that mental abyss the ring had built. Sam knew he couldn't rescue him by force. It was like trying to pull someone who is drowning and risking being dragged down with them. So he did what he knew how to do. He cared for him silently. He prepared the food, kept the path, watched over his friend's sleep, as if these simple gestures were invisible shields against despair. But even the strongest hearts have limits. There were nights when Sam wept silently, away from Frodo's gaze. He wept not from physical pain, but from the helplessness of watching goodness disintegrate before his eyes. The ring had achieved what few forces can, transform love into suffering. And what was once pure friendship was now emotional resistance, a love that persisted even without reciprocation. Sam's silence wasn't a lack of words, but an excess of feeling. It was a desperate attempt to remain whole when everything around him was falling apart, and perhaps unknowingly, it was this silence that still kept him human, the perfect contrast to the growing emptiness inside Frodo. Because while the bearer sank into his own voices, his friend remained like a dimmed but steady lighthouse, hoping that at some point, even if only for an instant, Frodo would look back and see him. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what follows shows that neither love, nor friendship, nor loyalty are enough to stop the power of mental isolation. When the true enemy ceases to be the ring and becomes the very fear of losing who one is. Mount Doom didn't just roar with fire and smoke, it seemed to pulse like a living heart, breathing in waves of heat and despair. Every step Frodo took was a sacrifice, every breath an act of resistance. The air burned his lungs, the crimson light reflected off the rocks like open wounds. Sam followed him, almost without strength, watching his friend stagger, dragging his exhausted body, but what weighed most heavily wasn't the physical fatigue. It was the silence, a dense, suffocating silence that seemed to vibrate inside Frodo's head. The ring no longer whispered, now it screamed. The voice that had once been a temptation had become an absolute presence. There was no longer I and it. It was a fusion. The ring spoke as if it were Frodo's own mind, and he could no longer distinguish where his thoughts ended and those of the golden creature hanging around his neck began. It was a subtle but relentless command. Don't destroy it. You fought, you suffered, you bled. It's yours. You deserve it. The words echoed with such force that they no longer seemed like suggestions. They were orders, and for the first time Frodo did not want to resist. The transformation didn't happen in an instant, but at that point it was complete. All the emotional weight, all the guilt, all the pain of the journey converged on that moment. And suddenly the meaning of the mission became distorted. Destroying the ring no longer seemed heroic. It seemed like a waste. The fire ahead, which had previously symbolized liberation, now seemed like a threat. Burning the ring would be like tearing away a part of himself, and Frodo no longer knew how to live without it. It was as if, at some point along the way, the burden had ceased to be an enemy and had become essence. What is most frightening at this moment is not the loss of reason, it is conviction. Frodo believed in what he felt. The human mind, when shaped by pain and obsession, is capable of creating perfect justifications for what previously seemed unthinkable. And that is what the ring did. It transformed slavery into purpose. Every scar, every tear, every sacrifice now served as an argument. You came this far, no one else could. So why give up the power you have gained? The manipulation was so refined that there was no longer room for doubt. Frodo believed that power had chosen him, and that destroying it would be denying his own destiny. Sam watched him helplessly. The friend he had sworn to protect was no longer there. There was a new expression on Frodo's face, something between ecstasy and madness. He held the ring as if holding his own soul, his fingers trembling, his eyes fixed on the gleaming gold that pulsed with a life of its own. Sam screamed, pleaded, wept, but none of it penetrated the invisible barrier that separated him from Frodo. The bearer was now completely under the sway of the voice, and at its core, that was the ring's true power, not to compel, but to persuade. It didn't take by force, it made the person desire to be taken. It was a form of possession so profound that it seemed voluntary. The dominion didn't come from fear, but from pleasure, the pleasure of feeling needed, invincible, chosen. Ego, pain, and pride merged into a single flame. Frodo no longer saw the ring as a curse, but as a reward. The suffering of the journey was now proof that he deserved to possess it. His mind spiraled between delirium and revelation. Fire roared all around, but the dominant sound was another. The inner scream, the absolute call. He is mine. 3 words that encapsulated the entire transformation. The hero who had left the Shire no longer existed. In his place was a being shaped by pain and power. The simple hobbit who once dreamed of peace now looked at destruction and saw beauty. It was as if the chaos around him reflected exactly what he had become inside. This scene represents more than a battle between good and evil. It's a portrait of the mind collapsing in the face of absolute power. Frodo had crossed the line between mission and identity. He no longer carried the ring, hear the ring. This merging is the darkest point of the journey because it reveals a universal truth. What we possess for too long ends up in some way possessing us. And when the object of sacrifice becomes part of who we are, letting it go is like dying. The fire of the mountain seemed to call to him, but he no longer heard it. He was in a trance, his eyes fixed, his face taken over by something bordering on the divine. It was the face of surrender, disguised as triumph. The same face Gollum had once displayed, and which now was reborn in another body. Sam saw the exact moment Frodo made the decision. It was a short, determined, almost serene look. There was no doubt or guilt, only certainty. The hero had vanished. The bearer had become the possessed. And it is at this moment that the true horror is revealed. The power of the ring was never just about destruction, but about replacement. It doesn't kill, it transforms silently until the original being ceases to exist. Frodo was now the echo of his own courage, the shadow of everything he fought to protect. The cry that echoed within the mountain was not just his. It was the cry of all the souls the ring had ever consumed. The same melody that had dragged kings, wizards, and warriors to the same fate. The mountain trembled, but it was as if the whole world breathed along with the ring. And, for the first time, Frodo felt peace. An illusory, poisonous peace, like the last breath before the abyss. He believed he had conquered fear, when in truth he had become its very manifestation. It was the culmination of a spiritual journey that began in the silence of the Shire and ended in the madness of power. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happens next is not just the fall of a hero, but the moment when the fate of the world depends on an accident, an impulse, a fraction of a second. The instant when corruption reaches its peak and redemption emerges from where no one expected it. When the ring was finally destroyed, the world seemed to sigh. The flames of Mount Doom roared like ancient thunder, consuming that which for ages had shaped the destiny of kingdoms, kings, and creatures. But the sound that dominated the air was not that of fire. It was silence. A deep, almost sacred silence that stretched like a cloak over everything. Frodo lay among the rocks, his body weak, his gaze lost. The heat around him was intense, but the cold within him was greater. The weight had vanished, and yet he felt as if something was missing. For the first time in a long time, the voice of the ring had fallen silent. But the silence that followed did not bring peace. It brought emptiness. Throughout the journey, the whisper had been constant, an unsettling presence, yes, but familiar. The ring had infiltrated his mind so deeply that, even as the enemy, it had become a companion. It knew his doubts, his weaknesses, his memories. Now, without it, Frodo felt a kind of loneliness that the outside world could not fill. It was as if, in losing the burden, he had also lost a part of himself. The silence was deafening, and the absence of evil, paradoxically, left an echo. What few understand is that the ring's power didn't end with its destruction. It left invisible scars, marks on the soul, on the way of thinking, on the way of feeling the world. Frodo realized that, however much the physical weight had disappeared, his mind still carried it. It was like someone who lives a long time in darkness and, upon returning to the light, discovers that their eyes no longer know how to see. The evil was gone, but the habit of fighting against it remained. And without anything to resist, Frodo began to lose himself in his own silence. The mountain crumbled, but within him another structure broke, the identity built around the burden. For so long, he had been the ring-bearer, the center of a journey, the symbol of hope. Now, he was just Frodo, and that was no longer enough. He no longer knew how to exist without the purpose that had consumed him. This is a point that few realize about the great battles of the soul. When the fight ends, the warrior doesn't know what to do with his own peace. The absence of conflict becomes the new challenge. Sam watched him with love and relief, but didn't fully understand what was going on inside him. Frodo smiled, thanked him, but there was something missing in his gaze, a distance that not even friendship could fill. The smile was a delicate mask, an attempt to remain human when everything inside him seemed dissolved. The journey was over, but the psychological impact of power would follow him like a shadow that the sun cannot erase. Back in the Shire, everything seemed the same, and yet unrecognizable. The flowers still bloomed, the fields still danced in the wind, the sound of bells echoed through the hills. But Frodo no longer fit into that scene. Simple things had lost their luster. The laughter of others sounded distant, as if it came from a time to which he no longer belonged. There was a kind of gentle melancholy in every gesture, a longing for what he would never be again. He tried to convince himself that the worst was over, but deep down he knew the evil was gone. But the emptiness remained. This emptiness wasn't pain, it was absence. It was the lack of the whisper that, however unsettling, gave meaning to existence. The human mind is like that. When it spends too much time living with darkness, it gets used to conversing with it. Silence, then, becomes unbearable. Frodo began to understand that the true destruction of the ring didn't happen in the mountain, but within him, and that the healing process would be long, perhaps endless. On some days, he believed he was free. On others, he dreamed of the golden gleam, the cool touch of gold, the sweet voice calling to him. It wasn't temptation, it was memory, a reflection of a time when, even in pain, he had a purpose. And that hurt him more than any wound. Because what truly gnawed at him wasn't evil, but the longing for when there was still something to face. The hero had won, but the man felt lost. The transformation the ring had brought about was irreversible. Frodo now saw the world differently, with depth, but also with distance. It was as if he saw everything through a thin mist, a filter between him and reality. He understood too much, felt too much, and therefore could no longer live as before. It was a kind of sad transcendence, attaining wisdom and losing peace. The burden had changed form, but not location. The most paradoxical thing was that the silence that tormented him also contained a hidden truth. Deep down, Frodo knew that this emptiness was part of the healing process, the space left by evil, waiting to be filled again by something true. But this required time, and time was what he no longer felt he possessed. The echo of the ring's voice still vibrated somewhere deep within, reminding him that every victory has its price. The world was saved, but something within it had been broken forever. Frodo was no longer the hobbit who had left the Shire, nor the hero who had saved Middle-earth. He was something in between, a man in transition, trying to relearn how to exist without the presence of that which had defined him. And perhaps that was the hardest part of the whole journey, surviving his own salvation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because from here on the story stops being about the ring and starts being about what comes after, about the psychological cost of being a hero, the invisible impact of transformation, and the bitter truth that some scars don't disappear, they just learn to be silenced. It's funny how certain stories stay with us, isn't it? Frodo's story, in the end, speaks less about the power of the ring and more about the invisible weight that each of us carries, those battles that no one sees, but that change us forever. If this journey has made you think a little differently about courage, silence, or even what it means to win, then I think the time we've spent together here has already been worthwhile. If you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from right now and what time it is there. I like to imagine this invisible map forming, people from so many different places connected by the same story. And if this kind of reflection resonates with you, subscribe to the channel to continue walking with me through these stories that have more to say than they seem. Also, leave your like. It helps this universe stay alive and shows that this conversation truly reached you. There's a video over here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. The journey isn't over yet, and there's much more to discover in the shadows and light of Middle-earth.